I don't usually share this story, mostly because whenever I've tried to tell it in person, people look at me like I'm insane, or worse, like I'm just trying to get attention. But I swear to God, everything I'm about to tell you happened exactly the way I remember it. It was the summer of 2011, and I was driving from Los Angeles up to Sacramento for a new job. I had just graduated from college and was eager to start my life fresh, away from the chaos of LA traffic, the endless bills, and the constant reminder that I was one paycheck away from sleeping in my car. The job wasn't glamorous. It was some dull office position, but it was stable, and that was enough for me at the time. The drive started off normal enough. I packed my small Honda Civic with the few belongings I had and set out early in the morning. I planned to reach Sacramento by late evening, maybe stop for food along the way, and check into an affordable motel for the night before reporting to work the next morning. But around Fresno, something strange happened. I remember passing a faded sign on the side of the highway that said, "The Silver Pines Motel, next exit." The name stuck out because I had been looking for a cheap motel, and I thought maybe this was some old roadside gem still clinging to life. I don't know what came over me, but something about that sign felt magnetic. It didn't look like a regular advertisement. The paint was peeling and the metal frame was bent in places like it hadn't been maintained in decades. Yet the words were still oddly clear in the afternoon sun. I convinced myself that maybe it was one of those forgotten, old-fashioned places that would have ridiculously cheap rates. So I took the exit. The road that followed was narrow and cracked, weaving between dry fields and a scattering of eucalyptus trees. I drove for what felt like 15 minutes before I saw it, the Silver Pines Motel. It was strange. The parking lot had about 5 cars, though none of them looked newer than the 1980s. The sign out front glowed faintly in neon, though the letters buzzed and flickered like a dying heartbeat. And yet, despite its shabby look, there was this weird aura around the place, like time itself had slowed down, pressing heavily against the air. When I walked into the lobby, a bell above the door chimed, but no one came to the front desk right away. The lobby smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic like rust or dried blood. The wallpaper was peeling, and the overhead fan turned lazily, creaking with every rotation. After what felt like forever, a woman appeared. She was in her 50s, maybe 60s, with hair pinned up in a messy bun and an expressionless face. She didn't ask me anything, didn't smile, just slid a key across the counter and mumbled, "Room 6, cash only." I handed her the $40 I had in my wallet, grateful it was cheap, and took the key. But here's where things began to feel wrong. As I walked to my room, I noticed the other guests. Or rather, I noticed how they didn't move. There was a man sitting in a chair outside his door, staring at the ground. A woman smoking a cigarette leaned against a railing, but the cigarette never seemed to burn down. Their eyes followed me, unblinking, as if I was the first new thing they had seen in years. When I unlocked room 6, I immediately regretted it. The smell hit me first, like old meat left out in the sun. The carpet was dark with stains, the curtains torn, and the bedspread patterned with cigarette burns. But exhaustion got the better of me, and I told myself I'd just crash for a few hours and leave early in the morning. I lay on the bed, fully clothed, and tried to fall asleep. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps pacing in the room above mine. At first, I didn't think much of it. Motels always had noisy neighbors. But the pacing continued for hours, a steady back-and-forth rhythm, heavy and deliberate. Around midnight, it stopped. I remember sitting up, relieved at the sudden silence, when I heard something else. 3 slow, heavy knocks on my door. I froze. My first thought was that maybe it was the woman from the office, or another guest. But the longer I sat there, the more wrong it felt. The knocks weren't tentative like someone needing help. They were heavy, measured, like a warning. I didn't answer. I didn't even breathe. After what felt like forever, the knocking stopped. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up at 3:07 a.m. My phone's screen glowed on the nightstand, But the strange part was, it showed no signal. Not even no service. Just a blank void where the bars should have been. Then I heard the pacing again, but this time it wasn't above me. It was inside my room. I sat bolt upright, scanning the darkness. At first I thought my ears were playing tricks on me. But no. The sound of heavy footsteps circled the bed. The air grew ice cold and I could see my breath fogging faintly in the darkness. I reached for my phone's flashlight, turned it on, and there was nothing. Just the same disgusting, rotting room. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, angrier, as if whatever it was knew I could hear it. I ran. I didn't even grab my bag. I tore out of room 6, sprinted across the lot, and bolted into my car. But here's the thing. I couldn't leave. The road I had driven in on was gone. In its place was nothing but endless fields stretching into the dark, under a moon that seemed far too big, far too close. I drove in circles for what felt like hours, passing the same flickering sign, the same eucalyptus trees, the same crumbling fence. It was like the motel had swallowed me whole. And then, just as suddenly as it began, I woke up. I was in my car, parked outside a different motel, the kind you'd see off any California highway. The Silver Pines was gone. My bag was in the passenger seat, untouched. My phone had full signal again. It was 6:30 a.m., and the sun was just starting to rise. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare. But when I reached Sacramento later that day and unpacked my bag, I found something that didn't belong to me. Folded neatly between my shirts was a room key. A heavy, rusted key with a tarnished brass tag. It read, Room 6, Silver Pines Motel. I grew up in a small desert town in Southern California, the kind of place where the days were long, the nights were cold, and nothing much ever happened unless you counted the occasional high school football game or a fight outside the only bar in town. We didn't have much in the way of excitement, but we did have history. Old mines, abandoned buildings, and desert ruins that reminded you this land had once been fought over, worked to death, and then forgotten. The story I'm about to tell you took place in 2016 when I was 22 and still living at home, trying to save up money to leave. I had a couple of friends, Marcus and Jamie, who were just as bored and restless as me. One Friday night, Jamie came up with the brilliant idea of exploring the old El Dorado mine. Everyone in town knew the stories. The mine had been active in the late 1800s, during one of California's many gold rush frenzies. But by the 1930s, it was abandoned after a string of mysterious deaths. People said the miners had gone mad, fighting each other, seeing things in the dark tunnels, hearing voices that weren't there. Some folks swore the mine was cursed. Others believed it was just a dangerous place with bad air and unstable shafts. But when you're 22, cursed sounds more like an invitation than a warning. So that night, armed with cheap flashlights, a couple bottles of water, and Marcus's old Jeep, we drove out into the desert. The mine wasn't hard to find. It sat at the base of a jagged hill, its entrance nothing more than a yawning black mouth cut into the stone. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded it, but half the fence had collapsed years ago. A faded "Keep Out" sign clung desperately to the wire, its letters barely visible in the moonlight. We parked the Jeep, killed the engine, and for a moment just sat there staring at that dark hole in the earth. I swear even before we stepped inside, the air around the place felt different, heavier, colder, like it carried a charge. Marcus laughed it off, saying it was just nerves. Jamie joked that we'd find gold and retire by 30. Me? I didn't say much. I just gripped my flashlight tighter and tried not to think about the stories my grandfather used to tell about the miners who had disappeared down there, only for their bodies to be found weeks later, eyes wide open, mouths frozen in silent screams. We ducked through the broken fence and stepped into the mine. The change was immediate. Outside, the desert night had been cool but breathable. Inside, the air was suffocating, damp and stale, like we were breathing in the dust of 1,000 forgotten lungs. Our footsteps echoed off the stone walls. mingling with the steady drip of unseen water. The deeper we went, the narrower the tunnels became. Timber supports, blackened with age, groaned under the weight of the earth. About 20 minutes in, we found our first sign. It was a helmet, old and rusted, lying in the dirt. Beside it was a pickaxe, its handle splintered, the metal head dark with something that didn't look like rust. Jamie picked it up and said, "Bet this was from the last guy who worked here." His voice bounced eerily off the walls, returning to us in strange, distorted echoes. We laughed nervously, but none of us could quite shake the feeling that we weren't alone. At one point, we reached a chamber where the tunnel split into 3 separate shafts. The left tunnel looked unstable, half collapsed. The middle tunnel stretched straight ahead, disappearing into darkness. The right tunnel seemed to slope downward, deeper into the earth. Marcus wanted to go right, but Jamie argued for straight. We settled on the middle, and that's when things started to go wrong. The deeper we went, the more our flashlights seemed to dim, even though the batteries were fresh. The air grew colder, our breaths forming faint mist. Then, without warning, Jamie stopped. He was staring at the wall, his light fixed on something scratched into the stone. When Marcus and I shined our beams there, we saw it too. Words carved deep into the rock. "It sees you." The letters were jagged, desperate, like they had been gouged out with shaking hands. We stared in silence until Marcus forced a laugh and said, "Probably some prank. Kids come out here all the time." But his voice cracked, and I could tell he didn't believe it either. We pressed on, though each step felt heavier than the last. Then, not far from the carving, we heard it, the sound of someone walking behind us. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on gravel. We spun around, flashlights sweeping the tunnel, but there was no one there. Just endless darkness. Jamie whispered, "Tell me you guys heard that." We nodded. Our nerves were frayed, but none of us wanted to admit we were scared enough to leave. Then came the shadows. At first I thought it was a trick of the light. My beam flickered across the tunnel wall, and for an instant I saw a figure standing there. Tall, lean, its face hidden in the dark. When I blinked, it was gone. Marcus cursed under his breath. He'd seen it too. Jamie insisted we keep moving, said we'd just scare ourselves worse if we stayed in one spot. So we walked. But the deeper we went, the louder the footsteps grew. Sometimes they echoed from behind us, sometimes ahead, sometimes to the side, as if the mine itself was alive, shifting, playing tricks with sound. My stomach churned with dread, and I remember thinking, this isn't right. We shouldn't be here. Finally, we reached a dead end. The tunnel just stopped, the stone wall rough and uneven. That's when we noticed something strange. In the dirt at our feet were 3 sets of footprints. Not just ours, these were deeper, older, as though someone else had stood there not long ago. And beside them was a 4th set. Larger, heavier, leading directly into the wall. Marcus swore and stepped back. Jamie bent down, tracing the prints with his hand. That's when the wall began to move. Slowly, impossibly, the stone shifted, and out of it stepped the shadow we'd seen earlier. It wasn't human. Not exactly. Its body was tall, unnaturally thin, its arms far too long. Its face was nothing but a smooth void, darker than the mine around it. And yet, somehow I felt it staring at us. We ran. God, we ran like our lives depended on it, because they did. The tunnels twisted and warped. Directions no longer made sense. My flashlight flickered, and each time it did, the shadow was closer. Behind us, ahead of us, beside us, it didn't matter. It was everywhere. I don't know how we made it out. One second we were lost. The next we stumbled through the entrance, gasping for air under the pale desert moon. We didn't speak. We didn't look back. We just climbed into Marcus's Jeep and drove until the mine was nothing but a fading memory in the rearview mirror. But here's the part that still haunts me. When I got home and emptied my pockets, I found something I had never picked up. It was a miner's helmet. Old, rusted, with my name carved into the inside. Not my initials. Not some coincidence. My full name, first and last, etched deep into the leather lining, as though it had been waiting for me. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone, I hear it again. The slow, steady crunch of footsteps in the dark. I first heard about Harmony, California from a coworker in San Diego who was a bit of a history buff. He mentioned it casually one day during lunch, saying, "You know there's a whole town on the coast that's practically abandoned, right? Population 18 last I checked." He told me it had once been a thriving dairy community in the late 1800s, but had fallen into ruin after a series of accidents, scandals, and deaths. Supposedly, the town still existed. A tourist oddity now, but rarely anyone actually lived there. Something about the way he described it stuck with me. Like a place frozen in time, clinging to life but never truly alive. I didn't think much of it until a few months later, when I found myself driving north up the Pacific Coast Highway after a bad breakup, just wanting to clear my head. That's when I saw the faded sign, Harmony, Pop. 18. The name felt like a cruel joke. Harmony. But the moment I pulled off the highway and drove into town, I knew something was off. The buildings, an old chapel, a pottery shop, a glass-blowing studio, looked weathered, sun-bleached, and strangely quiet. There were no cars parked, no lights on in the windows, no movement at all. The only sound was the ocean wind howling faintly in the distance, carrying with it the smell of salt and decay. I parked by the chapel and got out, stretching my legs. For a while I wandered aimlessly, peering into shop windows. Dust coated everything, thick enough to suggest no one had been inside for years. Yet the town didn't look entirely dead. There were fresh tire tracks on the road, footprints in the dirt, and in one window, I swore I saw a candle burning faintly. I remember thinking maybe the population count was accurate, that maybe a handful of eccentric artists or hermits still called this place home. As the sun dipped lower, I considered leaving. But then something caught my attention. In the window of the pottery shop was a vase. Ordinary enough at first glance, except when I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't decorated with flowers or patterns. It was painted with faces. Dozens of faces, each one detailed, etched in anguish. They weren't artistic renderings either. They looked real, like someone had captured people mid-scream and immortalized them in clay. I shivered and stepped back. That's when I saw her. A woman standing in the doorway of the chapel across the street. She wore a faded white dress, her long hair whipping in the wind. She didn't move, didn't wave, didn't speak. Just stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. I raised a hand awkwardly, thinking maybe she'd respond, but in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The chapel doors were shut tight. Most people would have left then, but I was curious, maybe too curious. I walked toward the chapel, each step echoing on the cracked pavement. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy, suffocating with the smell of wax and mildew. Candles lined the walls, their flames flickering, though I hadn't seen anyone light them. At the far end of the room stood an altar, and on it rested something that made my blood run cold. It was another vase, only this one wasn't painted. It was filled with teeth. Human teeth piled high, some yellowed with age, some fresh and white. I stumbled back, knocking into a pew, and the sound reverberated through the chapel like a thunderclap. That's when I heard it. Whispers. Low, layered voices coming from every direction at once. They weren't speaking English, at least not fully. It was a mix of words, some recognizable, others guttural and alien. My flashlight beam darted across the pews, but there was no one there. I bolted out of the chapel, gasping for air. The town looked different now. The sunlight was gone, replaced by an unnatural twilight that seemed to bleed into the sky, even though my phone said it was only 6:15 p.m. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the buildings, bending at wrong angles. And then I saw them. People. Dozens of them, standing in the streets, silent, still. still. Their faces looked familiar, horribly familiar, because I'd seen them before. They were the faces from the vase in the pottery shop. I tried to convince myself it was impossible, that my mind was playing tricks. But then, in perfect unison, they all turned their heads toward me. Not their bodies, just their heads, twisting unnaturally like broken dolls. Their mouths opened wide, impossibly wide, and the whispers returned, louder now, forming a horrible chant that rattled in my skull. I ran. I don't even remember which direction, just away from those faces, away from that town. The streets seemed to stretch endlessly, buildings warping, signs blurring. I swear I ran for hours, until suddenly, without warning, I was back at my car. The town behind me was dark, silent, like it had never been alive at all. I didn't stop to question it. I jumped in the car, slammed it into gear, and peeled back onto the highway. My hands shook so badly, I could barely hold the wheel. I drove until I reached Morro Bay, checked into the first motel I saw, and locked the door behind me. For a while, I convinced myself it had been some kind of hallucination, maybe heat stroke or exhaustion. But 2 days later, as I unpacked my bag, I found something inside that didn't belong to me. A small clay vase, crudely made, with one single face painted on it. My own. And when I smashed it in panic, hoping it would shatter into nothing, I discovered something horrifying inside. A tooth, fresh, perfectly intact, and unmistakably mine. I grew up in San Francisco, and for as long as I can remember, the Golden Gate Bridge has been a symbol of home for me. Tourists always see it as this majestic landmark, shining red against the fog. But for locals, it's something different. It's a constant presence looming at the edge of your vision, carrying with it all the stories people don't like to talk about. The suicides, the disappearances, the strange lights seen in the water below. You can ask anyone from the Bay Area, and they'll tell you that the bridge is more than just steel and cables. It's alive in its own way. And I learned that the hard way. Back in 2014, I was in a pretty dark place. My dad had died suddenly, and my relationship had fallen apart shortly after. I used to drive at night just to clear my head, letting the city lights blur past while I tried to forget the weight pressing down on me. One night, I ended up at the north overlook of the Golden Gate. It was late, maybe close to midnight. The fog had rolled in heavy, the kind of fog that swallowed everything whole, so thick that even the bridge's towers were barely visible. I parked, got out, and walked to the railing. For a while, I just stood there staring at the water far below. That's when I noticed something strange. The fog was moving, but not naturally. It swirled in tight circles beneath the bridge, like water spiraling down a drain. And in the center of it, just visible between the shifting clouds, I saw lights. Not from a boat, not from the city. These lights were deep beneath the water, moving slowly, deliberately, like eyes opening in the dark. At first I thought I was hallucinating. Maybe grief was finally breaking me. But then I heard it. A sound that rose up from the depths, vibrating through the steel under my hands. It wasn't a boat horn or the cry of a bird. It was low, guttural, almost like chanting. The kind of sound that seems to bypass your ears and go straight into your bones. I stumbled back, terrified, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The fog thickened, and suddenly, I wasn't alone. A man was standing a few feet away, dressed in clothes that looked decades out of place. Wool coat, wide-brimmed hat, shoes polished to a dull shine. He stared at the water, not at me, and in a hollow voice said, "It always calls the broken ones first." I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt cemented to the ground. I asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer. He just turned to me slowly, and I swear to God his eyes were black. Not dark, not shadowed. Black. Pits that seemed to stretch forever. Before I could react, he stepped onto the railing and jumped. I screamed, rushed forward, looked down. But there was nothing. No splash, no ripple, no body. Just the swirling fog and those impossible lights beneath the surface. My heart raced, and I bolted back to my car, Slamming the door shut like that would somehow protect me. But leaving wasn't so simple. As I pulled out of the overlook, my headlights illuminated something standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was the man again, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't human. It was tall, at least 8 feet, its body twisted and elongated, skin glistening as if wet. Its head was too small for its frame, and its arms hung down nearly to its knees. And in its chest, glowing faintly, were those same lights I had seen under the bridge. I swerved, heart pounding, and the figure vanished into the fog. I drove faster than I ever had in my life, not daring to stop until I was back in the city, surrounded by the false safety of neon lights and crowded streets. For days, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, heard that sound vibrating through my bones. I tried to convince myself it was stress, exhaustion, anything but real. But then something happened that I still can't explain. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, no postage stamp, just an envelope sitting on my doorstep. Inside was a single photograph. It was black and white, old, probably from the 1930s when the bridge was still new. It showed a group of construction workers standing on a steel beam, smiling at the camera. But there, in the water beneath them, half hidden in the shadows of the fog, was the same figure I had seen. Tall, distorted, glowing faintly, watching. And scrawled on the back in smeared ink were 4 words that still keep me up at night. It will call again. I've been to Yosemite National Park dozens of times in my life. Growing up in California, it was the go-to place for family camping trips, school hikes, and weekend getaways. Most people see it as one of the most beautiful, peaceful places on Earth. The granite cliffs of El Capitan glowing orange at sunset, the waterfalls crashing down in endless streams, the quiet majesty of the giant sequoias. But Yosemite has another side, one that doesn't make it into postcards. People vanish there, every year, without explanation. Rangers will tell you it's because of the terrain, the weather, or lack of preparation. And maybe sometimes that's true. But I saw something in Yosemite that made me believe otherwise. It happened in the summer of 2019. I'd gone alone, mostly to clear my head after a rough breakup. I set out on the Mist Trail, planning to hike up to Nevada Fall. The trail was busy at first, crowded with tourists, kids splashing in the river, couples taking selfies. But the higher I climbed, the thinner the crowd became, until it was just me, the roar of the waterfall, and the endless expanse of trees. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, cool mist clinging to my skin. For a while it was peaceful. Then, about halfway up, I noticed someone ahead of me. A man. He was tall, lanky, and wore an old-fashioned brown hiking coat, the kind you'd expect to see in black and white photos of the park from the early 1900s. His backpack was leather, cracked with age, and he carried a walking stick. At first, I thought maybe he was a reenactor, or one of those history buffs who like to dress up for fun. But there was something wrong about him. For one thing, he didn't make a sound. No crunch of gravel under his boots, no rustle of fabric, no heavy breathing from the climb. Just silence. He moved smoothly, too smoothly, as though the trail itself bent to his steps. And though I tried to catch up, the distance between us never seemed to change. After about 10 minutes, he stopped suddenly and turned. I froze. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, they weren't normal. They were blank, washed out, like river stones smoothed by time. He looked at me for what felt like forever, and then, without a word, stepped off the trail and vanished into the trees. I stood there, heart hammering, telling myself I must have imagined it. Maybe he'd just found a side trail I hadn't noticed. But when I went to check, there was nothing, just dense forest, too thick to walk through. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing. It was as if he'd dissolved into the air. Shaken, I continued up the trail. For a while, everything seemed normal again. But then I started hearing it. Footsteps behind me. Slow, steady, matching my pace. Every time I turned, the trail was empty. Yet the sound never stopped. By the time I reached Nevada Fall, I was on edge, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. I sat on a rock to rest, trying to convince myself I was just paranoid. That's when a ranger approached me. He was middle-aged, friendly enough, and asked how my hike was going. I hesitated, then told him about the silent man. His expression changed instantly. The friendliness drained from his face, replaced by something colder, more guarded. "Where did you see him?" he asked. His voice was low, serious. I pointed down the trail. The ranger sighed, muttered something under his breath, then looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you see him again, don't follow. Don't talk. And whatever you do, don't let him touch you." Before I could ask what he meant, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd of hikers at the overlook. I cut my trip short after that, too unsettled to enjoy myself. I hiked back down, half running, refusing to look behind me even though I could feel eyes on me the whole way. When I finally reached the parking lot and got into my car, I locked the doors immediately. Relief washed over me. I thought I was safe. But safety, I learned, is an illusion. That night, back at my apartment in San Jose, I unpacked my backpack. Buried at the bottom, wedged between my water bottle and first aid kit, was something I hadn't packed. A folded piece of parchment paper, brittle and yellowed with age. My hands shook as I opened it. It was a map of Yosemite, hand-drawn, detailed, every peak and valley carefully sketched. But it didn't look like the park as it is today. Some landmarks were missing, others had different names, and parts of the terrain seemed warped, almost unnatural. And scrawled across the top in faded ink were 4 words: "Follow me next time." I dropped the map, my stomach turning to ice. Because at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that looked fresher than the rest, was my name, written in sharp, precise letters. I burned the map that night, but sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear those footsteps. Slow, steady, silent, and deep down, I know he's still waiting.